The most dangerous weapon of the Cold War was not a nuclear missile sitting in a silo. It was not a submarine lurking in the Atlantic. It was a roll of microfilm, no larger than a human finger, hidden inside a box of cheap Soviet cigarettes. Moscow, 1961. The air is freezing, but Colonel Oleg Penkovsky is sweating. He is walking through the crowded streets of the Soviet capital, wearing the uniform of a decorated war hero. To the people passing him, he is a pillar of the communist regime. To the KGB, he is a trusted senior officer of the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence agency. But inside his pocket, Penkovsky is carrying the end of the world or the salvation of it. For the last 6 hours, he has been locked in his apartment with the blinds drawn, using a miniature Minox camera to photograph top-secret manuals stamped SS4 and SS5. These are not just technical drawings. They are the user manuals for the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal. They detail exactly how long it takes to fuel a missile, how to aim it, and how to launch it at an American city. Every click of the shutter is a death sentence. If the KGB knocks on his door right now, there will be no trial. A bullet to the back of the head is the standard prescription for treason. But Penkovsky keeps clicking. He is not doing this for money. He is doing it because he has looked into the eyes of his leader, Nikita Khrushchev, and he saw a madman. He believes that unless he gives the Americans the secrets to these weapons, his own government will accidentally incinerate the planet. In a few months, the information in his pocket will land on the desk of President John F. Kennedy, and it will be the only thing standing between the United States and a nuclear holocaust. Before we open the files on the highest-ranking Soviet officer ever to spy for the West, a question for the comments. Penkovsky betrayed his country to save the world. Does that make him a hero or a traitor? Let us know your verdict below, and subscribe to see the files the KGB tried to burn. To understand why a man would risk execution by firing squad, we have to look at who Oleg Penkovsky was. He was not a dissident hiding in a basement. He was Soviet royalty, a colonel in the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. Penkovsky was a decorated hero of World War II. He was married to a general's daughter. He lived in a luxury apartment in Moscow and had clearance to access the deepest secrets of the Kremlin. He was the ultimate insider. But beneath the medals and the crisp uniform, Penkovsky was boiling with rage. He looked at the Soviet leadership and saw incompetence. Specifically, he looked at Premier Nikita Khrushchev and saw a dangerous, uneducated gambler playing with nuclear fire. Penkovsky believed that the Soviet nuclear capabilities were being vastly exaggerated by Khrushchev's propaganda. He knew the truth. The Soviet systems were primitive, unreliable, and prone to failure. But he also knew that Khrushchev was arrogant enough to start a war he couldn't win, dragging Russia into total destruction. Penkovsky didn't see himself as a traitor to Russia. He saw himself as its savior. He believed the only way to prevent a war was to show the West exactly how weak the Soviet Union really was, so the Americans wouldn't be bullied by Khrushchev's bluffs. Getting this information out was nearly impossible. American diplomats in Moscow were under 24-hour surveillance by the KGB. If Penkovsky walked into the U.S. Embassy, he would be arrested before he reached the front gate. He needed a bridge. That bridge was a man named Greville Wynne. Wynne was a British businessman, a civilian who traveled to Moscow to sell industrial machinery. He was the perfect cover, boring, capitalistic, and seemingly harmless. But Wynne was working for MI6. In strict secrecy, Penkovsky began passing packets of information to Wynne during business meetings and dinners. The intelligence was so explosive that the CIA and British intelligence formed a joint operation to handle it. The Americans gave Penkovsky the codename Ironbark. This wasn't just rumors or gossip. Penkovsky was handing over the crown jewels. He provided the West with the organizational structure of the Soviet missile forces, the locations of their headquarters, and the names of the commanders. But his most critical contribution was technical. He didn't just say, "We have missiles." He stole the operating manuals. He photographed the launch procedures. He gave the CIA the physics and the math of the Soviet arsenal. For 18 months, Penkovsky lived a double life. By day, he saluted communist generals. By night, he wrote reports for President Kennedy. He traveled to London and Paris as part of Soviet trade delegations, where he would slip away to hotel rooms to be debriefed by Western handlers for hours, pouring out a flood of secrets. He was arrogant. He was demanding. He even requested to be photographed in a U.S. Army colonel's uniform during a secret meeting in London, because he wanted to feel like a soldier for the other side. The CIA and MI6 knew this couldn't last forever. Every time Penkovsky snapped a picture or passed a package, the odds of capture increased, but they couldn't stop him. The information he was providing was becoming the backbone of Western defense strategy. And then, in the autumn of 1962, the theoretical manuals Penkovsky had stolen suddenly became very, very real. The missiles he had described on paper were spotted in the jungle of an island 90 miles from Florida. Being a spy in Moscow in the early 1960s was not like a James Bond movie. There were no gadgets to make you invisible, no ejector seats, and no second chances. It was a gritty, terrifying grind of dead drops and silent signals. The KGB had the city wired. They had microphones in the walls of the American embassy, surveillance teams on every corner, and informers in every hotel lobby. To get information out, Penkovsky had to turn the mundane into the invisible. He used the oldest tools in the book: a box of candy given to a contact's child, a handshake in a crowded park, a packet of cigarettes left on a park bench. Inside these ordinary objects were spools of exposed film containing thousands of pages of top-secret Soviet documents. But the real flood of intelligence happened when Penkovsky managed to talk his way onto official Soviet trade delegations traveling to the West. In London and Paris, away from the suffocating surveillance of Moscow, Penkovsky exploded with information. In a hotel room in London, while his Soviet colleagues were out shopping or sleeping, Penkovsky would meet with CIA and MI6 handlers. He would talk for hours, virtually non-stop, fueled by nervous energy and a desperate need to empty his mind before he had to return to the USSR. The volume was staggering. Over the course of his operation, Penkovsky supplied more than 5,000 frames of microfilm. He provided the names and photos of hundreds of GRU and KGB officers, blowing the cover of Soviet spies operating across the globe. But the gold of the operation, the intelligence that would eventually save the world, was technical. Penkovsky didn't just tell the West that the Soviets had missiles. He handed over the instruction manuals for the SS-4 and SS-5 ballistic missiles. Think about what that means. The CIA didn't just know the enemy had a weapon. They knew exactly how that weapon worked. They knew the psi pressure of the fuel pumps. They knew the cabling diagrams for the launch consoles. They knew the precise sequence of orders a Soviet commander had to give to initiate a countdown. Crucially, the documents revealed the field footprint of a missile regiment. Penkovsky showed the analysts what a missile site looked like from the ground. The shape of the tents, the spacing of the trucks, the type of fencing used. He gave them the visual dictionary of a nuclear deployment. He also handed over something even more valuable: the truth about the missile gap. For years, Khrushchev had bragged that the Soviet Union was churning out missiles like sausages, implying they had hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, capable of hitting the United States. The American public was terrified. The Pentagon was scrambling to catch up. Penkovsky revealed it was all a lie. He showed that the Soviet ICBM program was plagued by failures. The guidance systems didn't work. The fuel was corrosive. In reality, The Soviets had only a handful of missiles that could actually reach America, and they took hours to prepare for launch. This knowledge changed the entire psychological landscape of the Cold War. Kennedy learned that he wasn't the underdog. He realized that Khrushchev was bluffing with a weak hand. But in October 1962, Khrushchev stopped bluffing about ICBMs in Russia and decided to put his shorter-range missiles, the ones that actually worked right, on America's doorstep. And when those missiles appeared on the U-2 photos, the CIA analysts didn't have to guess what they were looking at. Thanks to Penkovsky, they had the manual on October 15, 1962. When the analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center stared at the U-2 photos of Cuba, they were looking at a puzzle. They saw shapes. They saw patterns in the mud. They saw equipment they had never seen before on American soil. Without Oleg Penkovsky, those analysts would have been guessing. They might have underestimated the threat, or worse, overestimated it, leading to a panic reaction. But they didn't have to guess. They had the answer key. The documents Penkovsky had passed to Greville Wynne acted as the Rosetta Stone for the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the analysts saw the specific spacing of the tents in the San Cristobal jungle, they opened the manuals Penkovsky had photographed in Moscow. The diagrams matched perfectly. They saw the slash marks in the foliage, the clearings made for the missile erectors. Because of Penkovsky, they knew exactly why those clearings were there. They knew they were for the SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile. But the most critical piece of data was not what the missiles were. It was time. President Kennedy faced a horrific choice. The generals were telling him to bomb Cuba immediately because they assumed the missiles were ready to fire. If the missiles were operational, a blockade would be useless. However, Penkovsky's manuals contained the holy grail of intelligence, the readiness tables. The manuals explained that the SS-4 was a liquid-fueled rocket. It could not sit on the pad fueled up and ready to go. It had to be fueled right before launch, a dangerous process involving highly corrosive chemicals that took a specific amount of time. Using Penkovsky's data, the CIA analysts looked at the photos and saw that the fueling trucks were not yet connected. They saw that the nuclear warhead storage bunkers were still under construction. They calculated the math based on the Soviet manual. They told Kennedy, "Mr. President, these missiles are not yet operational. You have time." That specific assurance, the knowledge that the gun was loaded but not yet cocked, gave Kennedy the breathing room he needed. It allowed him to reject the immediate airstrike demanded by General Curtis LeMay. It gave him the confidence to impose the naval quarantine. Kennedy knew the capabilities of the Soviet weapons better than the Soviet commanders on the ground in Cuba did, because he had the book. But while Penkovsky's secrets were saving the world in Washington, his luck had finally run out in Moscow. The KGB had been watching. They had noticed the subtle changes in his routine. They had seen the nervous glances. As the world held its breath watching the ships in the Caribbean, a team of KGB agents was quietly breaking into an apartment in Moscow, dusting a chair with a toxic chemical designed to leave a mark on the clothing of a traitor. There is a cruel irony in the timeline of the Cold War. The exact same day that President Kennedy went on television to tell the world about the missiles in Cuba, October 22, 1962, was the day the darkness finally swallowed Oleg Penkovsky. While Kennedy was in the Oval Office, using Penkovsky's intelligence to stare down the Soviet Union, Penkovsky himself was walking into a trap in Moscow. The KGB had been patient. They had not rushed. They had watched him for weeks, building a dossier of damnation. They had broken into his apartment while he was out and installed hidden cameras and microphones in the ceiling. They had observed him fiddling with his radio, trying to receive coded messages from the West. But they wanted physical proof of his tradecraft. According to intelligence history, The KGB deployed a technique right out of a spy novel. They dusted the chair in his apartment, the one he sat in to decode messages, with a special chemical substance. It was invisible to the naked eye, but it would stain clothing and skin upon contact, marking the target like a branded animal. When Penkovsky sat down to work, he unknowingly marked himself for death. On October 22nd, as the American naval ships were steaming toward Cuba to enforce the quarantine, KGB agents arrested Oleg Penkovsky. It wasn't a movie shootout. There was no car chase through Red Square. It was quiet, brutal, and final. One moment he was a free man walking the streets of Moscow. The next, he was in the back of a black Volga sedan, flanked by men who didn't smile. Greville Wynne, his British contact, was not spared. The KGB tracked him down in Budapest, Hungary. In a violation of international diplomatic norms, they kidnapped him, drugged him, and dragged him back to Moscow to stand trial alongside his source. The timing was catastrophic for the CIA. Right at the moment when the Cuban Missile Crisis was reaching its peak, when the threat of nuclear war was highest, the line to their best agent went dead. The CIA handlers in Washington sent the signals. They waited for the response. But the radio silence from Moscow was absolute. Ironbark had been chopped down. For the remainder of the crisis, Kennedy and his advisors had to fly blind regarding any new developments inside the Kremlin. They had Penkovsky's manuals, which were invaluable, but they no longer had Penkovsky himself to tell them what Khrushchev was saying in private meetings. Penkovsky spent the remainder of the crisis, and the rest of his short life, in the dungeons of the Lubyanka prison. While the world celebrated the peaceful resolution of the missile crisis in November, the man who had made that resolution possible was undergoing brutal interrogation. He was stripped of his rank, he was stripped of his medals, and soon he would be stripped of his life. In May 1963, 7 months after the world stepped back from the nuclear ledge, the Soviet Union staged its final act of vengeance. The trial of Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynne was not a legal proceeding. It was a piece of theater designed to terrorize anyone else in Moscow who might be thinking of betrayal. It was held in the Supreme Court of the USSR, broadcasted to the public, with a script that had been written long before the judge took his seat. Penkovsky appeared in the dock wearing a dark suit, looking gaunt and broken. The arrogance of the colonel, who once demanded to wear American and British uniforms in secret London hotel rooms, was gone. He confessed to everything. He apologized. He recited the lines the KGB interrogators had likely beaten into him over months of isolation in Lubyanka. The prosecutor called him scum and a degenerate. The Soviet press painted him as a man motivated by greed and vanity, erasing any mention of his ideological conviction that he was saving Russia from a nuclear suicide. Greville Wynne, the British businessman who had been dragged into this nightmare, was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He would eventually be released in a spy swap for the Soviet agent Conan Malady in 1964. But for Penkovsky, there was no swap. There was no mercy. On May 16, 1963, the official announcement was made. Oleg Penkovsky had been executed. For years, a gruesome legend circulated in intelligence circles. The story went that Penkovsky was not just shot, but was strapped to a stretcher and slowly fed alive into a crematorium oven while his colleagues watched, a warning recorded on film to be shown to new GRU recruits. The truth, however, is likely less cinematic but equally cold. The standard Soviet method for execution was a single bullet to the back of the head in a soundproof cellar, followed by an unmarked grave. The bureaucracy of death in the Soviet Union was efficient, not flamboyant. He was simply erased. But while the man was destroyed, his legacy was bulletproof. Oleg Penkovsky changed the course of the 20th century in a way that no army or diplomat ever did. Because of him, the missile gap, the terrifying belief that the Soviet Union had thousands of missiles pointed at America, was proven to be a myth. President Kennedy went into the Cuban Missile Crisis with the ultimate weapon: certainty. He knew Khrushchev was bluffing because Penkovsky had shown him the empty cards in Khrushchev's hand. He knew the missiles in Cuba were a desperate gamble to compensate for weakness, not a show of overwhelming strength. Without Penkovsky, the United States might have invaded Cuba. The Soviet commanders on the island, armed with tactical nuclear weapons that the US didn't know about, would likely have fired them in defense. The chain reaction would have turned the northern hemisphere into a radioactive wasteland. We are alive today, in part, because a trader in a Moscow apartment decided to trust a British salesman with the secrets of the apocalypse. In the end, Penkovsky got exactly what he wanted. He wanted to prevent a nuclear war between the superpowers. He succeeded. But the price of that success was total oblivion. He died a villain in his own country, and for decades, his name was only a whisper in the West. He was the spy who warned us. And when the warning was heeded and the world survived, we left him to face the firing squad alone.